Welcome to Stat Masters, where we teach you how to use Player Profiler to win at fantasy football and better evaluate players. My name is Aaron Stewart, and I'm a senior analyst for Player Profiler, and my co-host is Chris Bonagura, a fantasy intelligence network analyst for Player Profiler. Chris, who are we talking about today?
So we're going to break down one interesting stat or takeaway from each team in the NFC South and just kind of break down each division for the next 8 weeks until the start of the season. But before that, we're going to talk about our topic/player of the day, which is Michael Pittman and his recent change in ADP. So using 4for4 is very fun and useful ADP tracking tool. If we look from last Monday to actually about 2 weeks ago, over the last 2 weeks, let's say, for Michael Pittman, he has moved down about 6 spots on Underdog. 5.4, trending to 6. I've seen Michael Pittman fall to the mid to late 7th round. Michael Pittman, who up until about 2 weeks ago was a 5-6 turn player, most of the time a mid 5th round player, he's falling because purely of situation. Nothing's changed. There's been no negative news. He's not injured. And now he starts to encroach onto a point where the argument for Michael Pittman is the same argument as Tyler Lockett and Amari Cooper from last year, where you were getting these very good players. When you hit the 7th round for a player like Michael Pittman, I no longer care about situation. Situation matters zero. I'm just going to draft a very talented player who is underpriced. Aaron, tell us just how talented Michael Pittman is.
When you brought up Amari Cooper, I went back and looked at the numbers on that tool for 4for4 with the ADP tracker, and I looked at how ADPs change from the start of July to the middle of July, and it's eerie how similar Michael Pittman and Amari Cooper are with their trends. They're obviously different types of players, different playing styles. However, last season, at this time, Amari Cooper's ADP had fallen by 5.2 spots, about half a round. He was going as wide receiver 31, overall 68.6 in Underdog best ball drafts. You look at this year, Michael Pittman's currently going wide receiver 34, overall 66.7 ADP. Amari Cooper, he was wide receiver 21, wide receiver 25. He was still productive, and yet the reason he fell is because there was quarterback uncertainty last season. Deshaun Watson was suspended. There's Jacoby Brissett going to be QB. Nobody wanted Amari Cooper, so he falls outside the top 30. What does he do? In PPR, he finishes as wide receiver 17. Probably finishes a little worse in best ball because it's half PPR. We're working with the stats player profiler. Look at Michael Pittman. He's coming off 2 pretty decent wide receiver 2 seasons. He was wide receiver 22 and wide receiver 21. Realistically, that cost of being wide receiver 34 should be his absolute floor. I'm talking back-to-back seasons that he's had a 25% target share. That's good. And look at the pass catchers for the Colts. I get it. People are fading Pittman because quarterback uncertainty. There's Anthony Richardson. How much is he going to pass? But if there's one guy that's going to probably feast and have a decent target share, willing to bet Michael Pittman's still going to hit that. And am I saying he's going to be a league winner? No. But at wide receiver 34, he's almost guaranteed to return value, and the price that he's been going at recently, you mentioned it, Chris, like he's slipping into the 7th round. He was going at the turn of the 2nd and 3rd round last year in best ball. He's the same player, but now he's going in the 7th round. This is why we don't hate players. We hate ADPs. And because of that, we really like Michael Pittman this year.
Well, he was also fine at the 5-6 turn. It's not that you're drafting to be a league winner. He's going to be a high advance rate player, the same as Cooper and Lockett last year. Cooper and Lockett didn't necessarily win you a best ball tournament, but they advanced you because they were so cheap and they offered a certain points floor. And you could say, okay, well, Lockett was competing with Metcalf, but also Geno Smith had an unbelievably good quarterback season from a passing standpoint that we're definitely not going to get from Anthony Richardson. But the combination of Brissett and Watson was not that good last year, and Cooper was just fine. Cooper still had Donovan Peoples-Jones score 130 half PPR points. Alec Pierce is a nice player, but he's not stopping Michael Pittman from getting the ball. I know last year was a bit of an anomaly, and at moments Michael Pittman didn't seem great. And we even came out on this show a month and a half ago and expressed a degree of doubt with Michael Pittman because Alec Pierce was getting everything down the field, even though Michael Pittman profiles as such an elite all-around route runner. But we were just saying in the mid-fifth round, it's something to think about. When we had said that previously, he was going before the likes of Chris Godwin, Hollywood Brown, JSN. Now Michael Pittman is going after Kadarius Toney, after Jordan Addison, after Treylon Burks, George Pickens, players with far more question marks. There is no question mark. Michael Pittman is a great wide receiver. If you put Michael Pittman on the Kansas City Chiefs right now, how high does he go? Second round pick, just behind Olave? How high does he go? Because it's very high, I can tell you that much. He was a 2-3 turn pick last year. At the very least, he went by the end of the third round in August. Now he's a seventh round pick. It's a no-brainer. I mean, the guy earns elite target shares, 25.6% last year, 25.7% the year before. You dive through his advanced metrics. He had a 97% snap share last year. He was on the field more than any other receiver. And of course, you would have liked to have seen more, but that offense fell apart. It's an obvious pick now. Hopefully the ADP corrects and he starts going back in the sixth round. But as long as he's falling, Michael Pittman is a great wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4 option that late in drafts. You don't even really have to consider it any further. You want to move on, Aaron, to the NFC South?
Yeah, let's move on to the NFC South, and we will start with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And of course, the question on everyone's mind is, Tom Brady's gone. Enter Baker Mayfield. Can they support all these weapons? These are guys that we've liked throughout the years, right? There's Chris Godwin. There's Mike Evans. There's even fans of Rashad White. What should we be thinking about Tampa Bay's new offense going from Tom Brady throwing it over 600 times to Baker Mayfield? Any concern from you, Chris?
When it comes to Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, none whatsoever. Tom Brady threw it over 700 times. To be exact, if we look at Pro Football Reference and we look at the stats from last year, Tom Brady had 733 pass attempts, which is a monstrous number, truly insane. Everyone's saying to be skeptical and or straight up avoid Godwin and Evans because of this idea that the passing volume is going to decrease so drastically and the idea that Baker Mayfield's no good whatsoever. Now, I agree Baker Mayfield's not great, but you can't necessarily say from what we've seen through his career that he's any worse than a Case Keenum or a Jacoby Brissett or a Teddy Bridgewater or one of these backup tier quarterbacks that play slightly better than most backups and can be a bridge quarterback for a year. And we've seen a lot of situations where a Case Keenum and a Jacoby Brissett and a Teddy Bridgewater have floated fantasy value for incredibly good players. And Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are two players that are too good to fail. I mean, Mike Evans is a bona fide Hall of Famer at this point with his 9,000-yard seasons in a row. People forget that Chris Godwin is easily a top 10 wide receiver talent in the league. If we were to rank them all in a vacuum, situation agnostic, Chris Godwin is right up there. We just forget because he was coming off the ACL last year and he missed the most critical period of fantasy football the year before, having torn the ACL in week 15. So he's not in recent memory, but Chris Godwin is incredibly talented. Now, the main argument is, there's not enough volume to go around. And of course, Tampa Bay doesn't throw it 733 times. A league average pass attempts is anywhere from 500 to 550 attempts in a season. Teams that are considered very pass heavy will eclipse 600, and teams like the Falcons, who don't pass at all, will pass around 450 times. And then everyone wants to throw in these very lame coaching-based narratives. Todd Bowles isn't going to throw it, this and that. Most teams' game plan or volume of offensive play, let's say, typically just forms itself around the talent on the team. You have better receivers, you throw more. You have better running backs, you run more, so on and so forth. So let's look at these 733 passes last year. You look at targets. 142 went to Godwin. 127 went to Evans. Everyone says, that was inflated by 733 attempts, but it's not. Those are career averages. If anything, Godwin's numbers were a little deflated coming off of the ACL. This is a dude who can earn 160, 170 targets. Let's look at the rest of this team. I mean, there is no more spread out team than the Tampa Bay Buccaneers last season. Leonard Fournette earned 83 targets. Rashad White earned 58 targets. That's 141 combined targets to running backs. That's an insane number. That's almost guaranteed to go down. Russell Gage gets 70 targets. Cade Otton gets 65 targets. Julio Jones, 43. Scott Miller, 40. Cameron Brate, 38. Rashad Perriman, 19. Kieft, 10 targets, right? Devon Tompkins, 10 targets. Even Cole Beasley sprinkled in 5 targets. I mean, Tampa Bay had 5 fringe players with 35 plus targets. And then so many guys sprinkling in. No teams go this deep. If you look at annual end of season box scores for every team in the last 5 years, it's so rare to see this many fringe players get involved. I added it up earlier, and just from fringe players that literally don't matter, that only Tom Brady is going to throw the football to, you can take 240 targets off the top right there and it not affect the potential target shares of Rashad White, Chris Godwin, and Mike Evans. If people don't think this offense under Baker isn't going to consolidate around its top weapons, it's just a nonsense thing to think. They can easily lose 200 total team pass attempts, and Godwin and Evans continue to be the elite players. And even more so Godwin, because Evans is flirting with age. So we look at ADP. Evans is very valuable. His ADP is 68.8, currently right now cheaper than Pittman, who we just spoke about. But in my experience this last week drafting, I do see Pittman falling past Evans a lot, but both of them are great values. Evans, you do have a risk of age, but at the 6'7" turn, you're not going to find a more talented player. Chris Godwin's ADP is 57.7, so he's mid to late 5th round pick. Again, you're getting a top 10 talent in the NFL in the mid to late 5th round because of uncertainty of situation, which we know for players this talented is almost always a fraudulent take in the offseason. I would go as far as to say that Chris Godwin is the wide receiver equivalent of what Josh Jacobs was last year for running back. You can't be surprised when Chris Godwin finishes as a top 10 receiver, now 2 years removed from the ACL. He's going to get absolutely peppered with targets. There's certainly some risk with touchdown equity. But if we run into a situation where Mike Evans does start to feel his age, slows down and or faces injury, and they hit the red zone and Baker can't just fall back on Mike Evans' unbelievable red zone talent, his next best option is Chris Godwin. Rashad White can certainly be good for fantasy this year on pure passing volume, but he's no red zone stud. Neither are the other running backs on that team. When they get down to that area of the field, it's Evans, it's Godwin. And how are they going to get down to that area of the field? Evans and Godwin. It's ludicrous to not draft these guys as cheap as they are, especially Chris Godwin. That was a mouthful, Aaron. Did you want to sprinkle anything on top, or did I more or less capture it?
I'll add a little bit more here because speaking of Mike Evans, you and I, we love Chris Godwin, and we have grown to really appreciate Mike Evans. And the key thing for him is, of course, he's the big play guy. He gets the deep targets. And the narrative on Twitter was, oh my gosh, he's going from Tom Brady to Baker Mayfield. Like Evans is just done. I'm pretty convinced that narrative is a big reason Mike Evans goes as wide receiver 36. And I'm here to say that narrative is false. Baker Mayfield has never been a fantasy football superstar. He hasn't, but in his 5-year career, his deep ball completion percentage has ranked top 10 3 times. And then there was a ranking of 13. And then his worst ranking was 18th. He usually isn't one of the leaders in deep ball attempts, but man, when he does have to throw deep, even this past season, he was number 6 in deep ball completion percentage. And what is Baker Mayfield getting? Mike Evans, who was number 3 in deep targets this year. And then he seems to be top 5 a lot of seasons. Worst case, he's in the top 20 in deep targets. Like the Mike Evans Baker Mayfield connection is not going to be as bad as what ADP would have you believe. Mike Evans at wide receiver 36, Chris Godwin at wide receiver 30, both are raging values. And what the nice thing is, like, you don't want both guys. You don't, because of the touchdown equity that you mentioned. They're probably not going to score as much as they would in a Tom Brady offense. But what I do like is, if you're like, man, I'm a little heavy on my Chris Godwin exposure rate, you've got the perfect pivot right there of Mike Evans around later. So we like both these guys. And Chris Godwin, too, he's in PPR. He's been a top 15 receiver 4 straight seasons. Yeah, we don't have to overcomplicate things. Godwin is still in his prime. He's not going to fall off. Could he finish maybe a little worse? Sure. But you're drafting him as wide receiver 30. Wide receiver 30. And during the course of those 4 years, along with Mike Evans' career, it wasn't like they had only Tom Brady throwing them the football. Like, they had Jameis Winston as well, good old gunslinger there. So I am confident that both these guys, who have produced before Tom Brady, produced with Tom Brady, that they can both produce post Tom Brady.
Yeah, also, Jameis Winston is not good. People only think Jameis Winston is good because of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. The 30-30 season was not good. That wasn't good football. It was terrible football. He just had a big arm and great receivers. And last tiny little nugget, week 17, the Bucs play New Orleans in the Dome. And that's going to be a chip on the shoulder game for the Bucs, who are likely eliminated at that point, and probably with a fired interim coach. And the Saints are going to be fighting someone in their division for a playoff spot at that point. And the Bucs are going to have no reason but to not just come out and throw it out there and try to keep the Saints from making the playoffs. That could be a sneaky tournament winning game in week 17. These guys could be high advance rates and tournament winners. I wouldn't sleep on them. But moving on, that was a lot of Tampa Bay talk. We can look at the Carolina Panthers now. And there's really not too much for the Carolina Panthers that we haven't necessarily covered. I want to bring up the idea that you can look at last year's stats, but there's really not much to see because everything's so different this year. Pretty much nothing's the same. I'm a big advocate of Miles Sanders. And it's not even necessarily a statistically driven argument. It's just the idea that when you sit down and think about how is a team going to matriculate the ball down the field, the most logical way for Carolina is Bryce Young dumping the ball off a rookie quarterback that I believe will be good at football, but is undersized. And we've seen with Kyler Murray and Russell Wilson a difficulty throwing it over the middle because of vision. We don't have any clear-cut established receivers. A lot of fringe, a lot of hope, a lot of optimism. And when you look at past year stats for pretty much any team, you can go on Pro Football Reference. It has it all nicely packed. And again, look through all teams for the last couple years. You see a common trend. When a team lacks a true number 1 receiver or a number 2 receiver, that's when you get teams that throw an obscene amount to their running back. They got to throw it to someone, and you can't throw it to untalented receivers, but you can throw it to semi-talented running backs. The Chiefs had no true good receivers last year. Juju only earned 100 targets. Jerick McKinnon had 77 targets. Jerick McKinnon and Clyde Edwards-Helaire combined for over 100 targets on the Chiefs. You're going to tell me Patrick Mahomes has to dump it off? Of course not. You have the combination of rookie quarterback and no talented pass catchers. Why can't Miles Sanders have an elite target share at running back this year? I think he absolutely can. But Aaron, I know you might be upset with me calling the pass catchers untalented. Did you want to go to bat for anyone?
I believe that people are starting to warm up to Miles Sanders. They're finally putting some respect on his name. But then the question does become, is there any value at all at wide receiver? And I will say, when we look at trends from last season with ADP, there were 2 teams that had 0 receivers drafted in the top 40. One was the New England Patriots, and the other was the Green Bay Packers. And the Patriots were very similar to the Panthers in that both teams, this year's Panthers team and last year's Patriots team, had 0 receivers drafted in the top 60, right? Like, when we are looking for value, there has to be value. There is going to be I guess, quote unquote, good pick of the Carolina Panthers receiver, because someone, you're looking at the depth chart here, if you're watching this video, one of these receivers will finish better than wide receiver 60. Now, the two choices I think are the most logical. First one is Adam Thielen. And the interesting trend with him is that since the start of July, he's gone down about a spot. And if you back it up to May, the start of May, he's gone down almost half a round. People are going, ooh, Adam Thielen, he's old. He's now on the Panthers. No more value. But here's the truth. Thielen's honestly been declining for 3 years. He's had that just slow decline in production that has been bailed out because, as you're looking here at the counting stats, he scored double-digit touchdowns in 2020 and 2021. But we've saw the yards per reception drop and drop and drop. And this past season, he didn't score double-digit touchdowns. The yards per reception seems to have kind of bottomed out, right? Like we know we're getting at least 10 yards per reception. That's not good, but at least we know, okay, this is what it is. It really hasn't continued to drastically fall off. And 6 touchdowns, that's honestly a reasonable amount. I could see him scoring 5 or 6 with Carolina this year. I could see him getting 100 targets because who else besides Thielen? They did give him a 3-year contract, and he finished right outside the top 40 in PPR. And just remember, where you're getting him is outside the top 60 wide receivers. You can sprinkle in some Adam Thielen because it's going to be points. It's going to be some points that help you. You start 3 receivers and a flex. You're probably going to get some starts from Adam Thielen. But if Thielen isn't your cup of tea and you want to swing for upside, there is Jonathan Mingo. I will say that you've got to be cautious with him. He's gone down a couple of spots since the start of July. He's gone down 2.2 spots, but since May 1st, he has risen 28 and a half spots over 2 full rounds. Now, Jonathan Mingo has the exciting rookie profile that we look for. He's big, he's fast, he got the draft capital early second round. And Lance Zierlein does prospect grades each year for players, and I like looking at those when I'm preparing for dynasty rookie drafts. He didn't have a bad grade either. So he checks a lot of boxes, and dare I say, this might be a little heresy. If you compare a lot of those things to Christian Watson, there is some similarities. Big, fast prospect. A lot of people were surprised about draft capital, but they both got top of the second round NFL draft capital, and their draft grades by Lance Zierlein almost identical. I think Mingo's was better by 0.1. They played different styles, but there's a lot of similarities there. And Christian Watson, we were surprised of the season he had as a rookie. Mingo could surprise people this year too. And I would honestly say it comes to the build of your team. I would prefer more Adam Thielen because kind of that late in the draft, a lot of people go for upside. I want points. I want to be able to fill my wide receiver 3 and flex spot pretty consistently. But Mingo does have some upside. I would sprinkle in. I don't like Mingo that much as a prospect. But in looking at all these different things here and checking all the boxes he does, I go, I need to have 3 to 4% minimum exposure rate on Jonathan Mingo. And with DJ Chark, there's nothing to talk about with DJ Chark. He's just a terrible best ball pick. But I will say he's going a round later than Mingo and Thielen because this is an ambiguous wide receiver room. Nobody knows who the alpha is. But all DJ Chark really is going to be is a player you play in DFS because he's going to be cheap. He gets a lot of air yards. I don't want that in best ball, though. And the reasons why is the past 2 seasons, he's had a problem with his ankle. He missed significant time with a high ankle sprain last season. And the year before, he had an ankle fracture. So DJ Chark, the DFS play, because you're not committing yourself for the entire season because he's not going to play an entire season. There's a reason it took him a while to find an NFL team. So in this receiving room, it's Thielen, Mingo a little bit for upside. Terrace Marshall is free, but come on. He's been in the league for 2 years. And if Marshall was any good, why would the Carolina Panthers have signed Adam Thielen and DJ Chark and used a high second round pick on Jonathan Mingo? That's your answer right there. Terrace Marshall, he's not going to give you anything. I think he's a waste of a pick in the 18th round.
There's nothing exciting in this receiving room. Thielen is a relatively safe bet for 120 to 140 fantasy points. If you really just need a wide receiver 5 and you want to balance him out with some higher upside guys, he could certainly help advance you through a couple of weeks. But otherwise, it's very boring. All those things you said about Jonathan Mingo were very nice, but I wasn't sure if you were describing Jonathan Mingo or Denzel Mims or Terrace Marshall or Jalen Reagor or insert player X with size and no pedigree drafted early in drafts to never do anything here. So certainly not excited, but you want to take 2 or 3 stabs at him out of 150 entries into a contest, I guess. But if I'm going to take the no pedigree size speed guy simply for his size and speed and draft capital, give me the one tethered to Patrick Mahomes, and I'll take Rashee Rice over Mingo, who's a little cheaper in drafts. But we're not talking about the Chiefs today. We're talking about the NFC South. So we'll move on. I feel like you basically covered Carolina. I'm still pretty much just drafting Miles Sanders. But we'll go on to the Saints. Saints are a very interesting story when you look at what they did last year. And now there is a lot of the same that we can look at from last year. Granted, you're getting a quarterback upgrade. The Saints still had about 500 total pass attempts from their quarterbacks combined. Quarterback play was bad, so you can expect a huge upgrade with Derek Carr. But the roster itself is relatively the same. Some minor changes on the back end, but nothing crazy. So when you look at, for example, the running back stats from last season, the Saints had 465 total team rush attempts out of the backfield. They just did it with a lot of different guys, mostly Alvin Kamara, who doesn't necessarily profile as a rusher. But then you also look at receiving, and Alvin Kamara still got 77 targets, and Mark Ingram got 18 targets. They had over 100 targets to running backs as well. The moral is to say that the Saints have tremendous opportunity available for running backs this season. If we're going to go on the history of this coaching staff and the running back room, I think it's safe to say Chris Olave is going to be the clear-cut target leader here. And because of the Saints' very easy strength of schedule, even in the second round, if you don't necessarily feel like he'll hit that ceiling, you have to take the volatile weekly upside and the fact that he could be a league winner in those playoff weeks. Another interesting fact about the Saints and why pretty much every player on this roster should be looked at closer to their upside case than their floor case. The Saints play 13 games in a dome this season. 13. The other 4 games are in warm weather areas, and 3 of them are in the first 6 weeks of the season. The Saints will probably have the smallest effect on their ability to play football next year by weather of any team we've seen in a long time. And by Warren Sharp's strength of schedule, the Saints and the Falcons both have the easiest schedules in the league by far next year based on win totals. Take that with a grain of salt, but we saw last year the Giants had the easiest schedule in the league by far with Warren Sharp's strength of schedule by win totals. And a lot of the Giants players hit their bowl cases. So it doesn't say that, that the easy schedule makes the Saints an elite team. But whatever the range of outcomes is, with the good weather and the easy schedule, you can push them slightly higher. You do see a spreading of the ball, similar to Tampa Bay, with less volume. And when you don't have a consolidated offense, right? When you don't have a Minnesota, where for years it was just Jefferson, Thielen, Cook, right? You don't have a Eagles, where it's all Brown, Smith, Goddard, and Sanders. If there's no clear-cut target leader, teams will just throw the ball to everyone. Now, Tampa Bay was a unique case where it did consolidate around the target leaders, but then they just threw so much that everyone got involved anyway. After Olave with his 119 targets, the next highest receiver target total is Rashid Shaheed at 34 targets. Or I'm sorry, it was actually Jarvis Landry at 39 targets, who's no longer with the team. the Saints had 6 players between 20 and 35 targets. It was very spread. Their target leaders included Juwan Johnson and Alvin Kamara, and not much has changed. I have zero faith whatsoever that Michael Thomas ever sees the football field again in a meaningful way, and I'm completely projecting the team as if he's not there. I don't see how you could do any different, seeing as he's now over 30 and hasn't played in years with an obliterated ankle. It's a real shame, but Michael Thomas is gone. Chris Olave has all the opportunity in the world, and we're going to see another situation where the tight ends sprinkle in. We can keep betting on Taysom Hill to be an anomaly and have those 2-3 weeks where he just finds the end zone. And I'm really focusing on these Saints running backs. I like Derek Carr because he's super cheap as a QB2 option. You can really sprinkle him in with any quarterback and help bolster your QB floor while also giving you a nice playoffs QB ceiling. The Saints have a very easy playoff schedule, all in a dome. And when you think about these running backs, you just do the thought experiment of Kendre Miller, Alvin Kamara, and Jonathan Williams. Williams, I think, will be a touchdown leader in the month of September because let's assume Alvin Kamara gets suspended 4 to 6 games, which seems to be very likely at this point. We know Kendre Miller is coming off of a meniscus tear, and they say he's going to be playing by preseason, but he still hasn't participated in anything with the team. So Jamal Williams, for all intents and purposes, is going to absolutely crush September with Kendre Miller sprinkling in as a change of pace and satellite back. And then when Alvin Kamara comes back, he should resume a dominant receiving role pretty much immediately. But in terms of on-the-ground efficiency, he hasn't been that great the last 2 years. For whatever reason, they've given him a high rush total, which isn't really his MO. And, 3.7 and 4.0 yards per carry isn't necessarily great. His yards per touch was number 25th. His total yards created was nice, number 9 in the league, but his yards created per touch was 15th. So he was only creating yards based on volume. He wasn't actually being efficient with it. He was only 25th in dominator rating, despite being the only talented running back on the team. Wasn't breaking away runs, a 2.7% breakaway run rate, 49th in juke rate, 28th in evaded tackles. It's not unreasonable to say that Alvin Kamara is essentially cooked as a pure runner. But that doesn't matter because he's still a good receiver. He can still catch the ball. He still had 8.6 yards per reception, number 8 in the league. He was number 2 among running backs in route participation. And he earned an 18.2% target share with 1.76 yards per route run. That was number 6 among running backs. So if Alvin Kamara comes back in after that suspension and starts earning meaningful targets per game, what I think would happen is we see Jamal Williams' role shrink and Kendre Miller get more involved on early downs because Kendre Miller profiles as being able to do all 3 roles, just not necessarily being hyper efficient at any of them. I see him as similar to a David Montgomery. And I think there's a world where in different ways they all can contribute to your fantasy lineup. And then when you look at costs, none of them are necessarily expensive. Obviously, you take on the most risk with Kamara at around ADP of around 100. You're taking on a lot of risk for a guy that's essentially cooked as a runner. Jamal Williams is the best value at 126. He's in the early 11th round. But now if you combine Williams with a Breece Hall, with a Javonte Williams, with a Jahmyr Gibbs, any of these runners that have home run hitting upside, league winning upside, but probably project to start slow, Gibbs because he's a rookie in a timeshare, and the other 2 because they're coming off injury. If we look at the final fantasy stats of Jamal Williams combined with Breece Hall, it's probably going to be the RB1 overall next year, right? And then Kendre Miller, certainly there's risk. The real risk with Miller and Kamara is touchdown equity. I think there's volume, but we know they're going to sprinkle in Juwan Johnson and Foster Moreau and Taysom Hill in the end zone. Chris Olave is going to get his. Jamal Williams is going to vulture his. And then even Derek Carr is a very scrappy red zone runner. Touchdown equity is certainly a problem, but sprinkling these Saints running backs into your best ball exposure portfolio is 100% going to be a good approach to having healthy exposures in 2023. There's a lot of meat on the bone for this team, especially with the very thin wide receiving room. again, Aaron, I'm sorry. I just kind of took the ball and rolled with it. You want to add in?
Yeah, I mean, I did that with the Panthers. You did that with the Saints. It works out. The things that I'm going to add real quick is looking at the offensive weapons here for the Saints and ADP in best ball. Chris Olave, of course, is towards the top. He's currently going in the top 20. And there's only one other player that's going in the top 100. And I'm here to tell people you're wrong for this. But Michael Thomas sneaks into the top 100 with an ADP of 94. All the other weapons, everyone is outside the top 100. When I see that, I go value, value, value. I will expect Alvin Kamara's to start to go up a little bit. Currently, he's 101, and I'll get into the news we had on Kamara recently. I'll get into that pretty soon. But yeah, when you talk about Jamal Williams, great value. Yeah, it was 126. Like there is points early in the season. And yes, we want the points at the end of the season. But if you don't score points at the beginning of the season, you're not even going to have a chance to compete. So there's a potential role for Jamal Williams he'll solidify it early in the season. And who knows? Like it's unlikely, but maybe he has that role where he's just the goal line guy. He scores good amount of touchdowns, just keeps the ball rolling on the ground. Like Williams can return some value. He certainly can. It's half PPR. It's not PPR. If it was PPR, yeah, we're in trouble with Jamal Williams. But you discussed it with Alvin Kamara. There has been a clear decline in his rushing ability. A full yard of his yards per carry decreased from 2020 to 2021, and then it stayed the same. He's not the same runner. So give me Jamal Williams. Give me Kendre Miller, who's even cheaper, even though Kamara – he's got, I guess, technically some good news to be brief on this. He's not going to have a felony. It's going to be a misdemeanor. I'm not a legal expert, but what I can give you is that historically, this is what the NFL does, is there are things they look at. One is, are you a repeat offender? And Alvin Kamara is not. This is his first strike. Second thing is the NFL doesn't like domestic violence there. So this case is not domestic violence. And here are the two examples I have. Zeke, a few years ago, 2017, Ezekiel Elliott got 6 games, domestic violence. You go back to 2008, old offensive lineman Bryant McKinney got 4 games for aggravated battery outside a nightclub. Honestly, Bryant McKinney's situation sounds about as similar as it can get to Alvin Kamara's. So if I was willing to guess on how many games Kamara is going to be suspended, probably 4 games, right? So because of that, adjust accordingly with Alvin Kamara. I kind of feel that people, when they've been drafting him, have just assumed, oh man, worst case scenario, he's going to miss like the entire season. So Kamara's ADP will go up. But I'm not going to forget about Jamal Williams and Kendre Miller. One of those two guys is going to have a pivotal role of being the quote-unquote lead running back, emphasis on running. And Derek Carr's ADP has also been falling too. So it's an interesting thing there. Like there's some weapons that you can pepper in the mid to late rounds that you want because you discussed it. They're going to play so many games that are in a dome and not affected by weather. And it doesn't really matter if you're quote unquote talented at that point. When you're playing games in December and January and not having to play in a snowstorm, we saw games like that late in the season where you couldn't play any of those guys. They couldn't do anything. I remember a Browns game that was like that. The conditions were so bad. Didn't matter that there was extremely talented players on the field. The weather's always going to win. So those Saints players, the ADPs are falling, pepper them in. I feel like the teams that do well in Best Ball Mania are going to have a Saints player contribute for them. The difficult part now is just going, which one?
Yeah, they're all going to be relatively good advance rate players, and Chris Olave is going to be the one real, those good weather playoff games. He could be the guy in week 17, and then there's no price that's too high. Derek Carr is a really good quarterback to draft at around pick 150 where he goes, because you're at least not taking a 0. So yeah, there's probably 1 or 2 guys in that range or after him that will outperform him. but he's going to be a mid to high QB2. You're not going to be a league winner. It's not going to be a top 10 quarterback. You know that for sure. But he's going to score some quantity of like 260 to 280 fantasy points, and it's not a zero. And you just pair him with like a Mahomes, a so on and so forth. He's a great QB2 if you just want to play it safe, bolster that QB floor. And what's going to happen is if the suspension ends up being less than expected, let's say 4 games, you're going to start hearing people who've been fading him entirely, haven't drafted him at all. They're going to start to rationalize their position, and they're going to start to notice and point out inefficiencies in Kamara's game. And you're going to hear the argument, I wouldn't take him in the top 100 even without the suspension because he's just not good anymore. And like that's already baked in. If he's not suspended at all, then he is the cheapest aging running back who used to be elite by far. And if let's say Alvin Kamara was 25 with a 6-game suspension known for sure, he wouldn't fall out of the 6th round. And we've seen this happen many times. So it's already baked in. Anyone who tells you that is lying. I probably have 6% Kamara after 96 Best Ball Mania 4 drafts on the chance that the suspension was less. It's the right price. It's not a comfortable price, and he could just suck even if healthy. But I don't know. I can't see the future. So last team, we'll go super quick because we kind of already broke down the Falcons pretty recently on this show. I think my main takeaway with the Falcons that I'll just reiterate is that people necessarily are getting it wrong. You have 3 elite weapons all taken in the top 10 of their respective NFL drafts. I think London, Pitts, Bijan Robinson are all safe to draft. I've noticed on Twitter in the last week, like 5 or 6 big time fantasy football accounts, people with over like 100,000 followers, finally putting out positive Desmond Ridder tweets as if they just discovered him. Anyone who follows this show knows I've been telling you to draft Desmond Ridder since like March. Desmond Ridder was always a great pick. He'll very much be this year's version of Daniel Jones. He's a hyper athlete with great weapons, and he's better at throwing than people realize. And sophomore players at all positions tend to be, very good chances at being breakouts. The one thing that's going to limit Falcons players in fantasy football this season is touchdown equity. There's plenty of pass volume and rushing volume to go around. There's only going to be so many touchdowns because they're going to play so slow and try to eke out games with Arthur Smith and the Mike Vrabel smash mouth football. Just don't draft multiple Falcons. One will succeed. One will be okay at ADP, and 2 will probably be bust. Look at the Steelers from last year, right? Deontay Johnson scores 0 touchdowns. He's worthless. But Pat Freiermuth was a great tight end pick. Only one can really succeed, but we have no idea which one. The key is just to identify that they're all good and hope you get lucky and pick the one who has the best touchdown variance of the group. Aaron, let's hear it.
The reason Desmond Ridder is the best pick for the Atlanta Falcons that you can make for your best ball team is look at the top weapons. We all know his weapons. Bijan Robinson, we've got Drake London, and we got Kyle Pitts. Bijan's being drafted as RB3, and he's being drafted as a first-round pick. Kyle Pitts is being drafted as tight end 5. Drake London is going just outside the top 20 wide receivers with an ADP just outside the top 40 overall. For all these things in theory to hit, right, for us to place those ADP values for those guys, the guy that delivers the ball to him has to be decent. Doesn't even have to be great, just has to be decent. And yet Desmond Ridder is going outside the top 200 players. He's got athleticism. We have a small sample size, and that's the hard thing, but we have a game where he rushed for 38 yards, right? We only have one game that he threw touchdowns. But he can improve. That situation he came into, they obviously wanted to see what they had with him, and they had to have been impressed to a degree because they didn't really do anything at QB. Like they could have gone and drafted their next quarterback, but they're going to give Desmond Ridder a chance this season to be the guy. And he's a last round pick. There's no risk whatsoever. And all this upside. I mean, he ran a 4.52 for quarterbacks. That's 98th percentile. He's got big hands. He can throw. And even if he can't throw that well, look at the guys he's throwing the ball to, even some of the tertiary options, right? Tyler Algier, he's an okay running back too on a team. Cordell Patterson's just a weapon. Desmond Ridder is the Atlanta Falcons player you want on your best ball team.
Yeah, it's that simple. And I'm certainly sprinkling in the other ones. And there's nothing wrong with taking Bijan that early. I'm just not going to do it 20% of the time. I'll do it the healthy 8%. But that pretty much wraps it up. That's how we see the NFC South for big style best ball tournaments.
Thanks for joining us on Stat Masters, your go-to for fantasy football insights. From player analysis to breakdowns, we've empowered you to dominate your leagues. Stay subscribed for cutting-edge analysis to keep you ahead of the competition. Keep the conversation going, stay passionate, focused, and victorious. This is Stat Masters signing off.
Hey, you like that video? Be sure to subscribe and activate those alerts so you get notified as soon as new videos drop. And be sure to check out playerprofiler.com. We have all the tools for you to dominate every type of fantasy league. We have a draft kit, Dynasty Deluxe, data analysis, DFS Dominator, and don't forget the player rankings to rule them all.